My name is Nicola Wardhaugh, and I'm an acupuncture practitioner and researcher. In 2018, I conducted a research study for my MSc in acupuncture at the Northern College of Acupuncture in York. The title of the study was Participants' Perception of Effects of Auricular Acupuncture on People Affected by the Grenfell Tower Fire, a cross-sectional survey. I'm an acupuncturist based in southwest Scotland, where I run busy practice in the beautiful town of Moffat in Dumfries and Galloway, where I treat a wide variety of patients and conditions. I qualified as an acupuncture practitioner in 2018 after 3 years of study at the Northern College of Acupuncture. My MSc research project was designed to explore the perceptions of acupuncture in a group of people who were affected by the Grenfell Tower Fire and who attended a temporary acupuncture clinic at a local mosque in the aftermath of the fire. As many people will remember only too well, there was a major human-made disaster in 2017 when a fire broke out at Grenfell Tower in North Kensington, London. 72 people died either in or after the fire, and countless others, of course, were bereaved. Many were displaced. It was a huge trauma for victims' families and friends, and for the communities that all of these people were a part of. A group of acupuncturist volunteers got together to start a clinic that ran every week at the Al Manor Centre in North Kensington, supported by the charity World Medicine and the organisation NADA GB. At the clinic, the acupuncturists used the NADA protocol, which is a type of acupuncture using 5 fixed points on the ear. In general, acupuncture is a low-cost and relatively safe intervention, and it's used more and more often across the world to reduce the effects of trauma in people who are affected by trauma and conflict. I carried out this study with 2 purposes in mind. First, to demonstrate the impact of the clinic to help the volunteers secure future funding, and second, to contribute to the evidence base for acupuncture in humanitarian aid situations to help support the inclusion of acupuncture in crisis planning. I designed a small-scale cross-sectional survey, which was qualitative and observational in nature, because this methodology is often used to explore patients' experience. Then I used this data to investigate the relationship between acupuncture treatment and the effects that patients perceived. And this is something that the literature on qualitative research calls patient-perceived effects, or PPEs. Then I worked from this to make inferences about the population as a whole. I took a convenient sample of 13 participants and I held a face-to-face semi-structured interview with each one. Korstens and Moser describe this as eliciting the participants' experiences, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. And this was the main source of information I needed to answer my research question. My topic was very sensitive, and my participants were more vulnerable than most. Because of this, I was very careful to integrate an ethical approach at each stage of the process. I also incorporated a high degree of reflexivity. Just to explain that a bit, in general, qualitative research positions the researcher as a co-creator of knowledge alongside the researched subject. Reflexivity invites the researcher to explicitly reflect and acknowledge the potential biases and to report these transparently. It explores the researcher's assumptions, cultural positioning, and their emotional reactions in response to the qualitative data collected. It helps mitigate biases and improves the quality and trustworthiness of the research. When I had carried out the interviews with my 13 participants, I transcribed them and removed any identifying information. I then used a process of reflexive thematic analysis to analyse the data. Reflexive thematic analysis is a development of Braun and Clark's original thematic analysis, and it positions the researcher's role in knowledge production at its very centre. So I used a reflexive diary to record thoughts and feelings relating to my research, and I made what are called analytic memos about my responses to the data during analysis. These were all considered as part of the analysis process because at times they influenced my decisions about how to analyse and synthesise my data. I also went looking for negative and aberrant cases. In other words, data that didn't quite fit the overall emerging patterns, because the non-fitting data is helpful in producing an accurate representation of the data overall. So what did I find? Well, it was a rich set of results. The 13 participants reported symptomatic improvements in their mental and physical health, but they also reported wider whole person effects, which is a type of biopsychosocial patient-perceived effect, as I referred to on the last slide. Whole person effects is a term that's drawn from some research done by Patterson in Britain back in 2003, and it's particularly applicable to acupuncture. In this study, participants described positive changes in state or changes in well-being that related to their personal and social identity. Several participants reported non-positive effects alongside improvements, such as minor bleeding, no effects, or feeling unsure whether there had been an effect. Cumulatively, the research demonstrated that auricular acupuncture is an acceptable treatment for this particular population affected by a person-made disaster. Mapping out the findings was a fascinating and complex process. I did these as mind maps to illustrate the relationship between the themes, the sub-themes, and the interrelated effects. The numbers in brackets show the numbers of participants out of the total 13 who reported a theme. So just to come back to these wider biopsychosocial effects, or whole person effects, as you might call them, just to give some examples, participants talked about feeling more relaxed, which was the most frequent effect that was discussed. Others talked about feeling uplifted. Others talked about changes in their personal or social identity, feeling more connected and finding joy, or finding a renewed purpose in life. The speech bubble here is a quote from one participant that shows how she felt acupuncture had affected her. When I compared my findings to previous studies published on the effects of acupuncture in other humanitarian aid situations, they were similar, but because all qualitative research takes place in a certain context, and that context is specific and usually fairly unique, there were some differences and variations between my results and the results from other studies. For instance, in my study, the group setting might have been of particular value during recovery from trauma, whereas other studies have looked at individual treatment settings. It's also the case that my study was a cross-sectional study with no follow-up, so I couldn't compare my results with studies that did do follow-ups to explore the nature of changes over time. I talked earlier about reflexivity and how important it was to this study. I now want to draw out here some ways in which reflexivity brought out some unique and valuable aspects of the study. Positionality is a foundation stone of reflexive principles in data analysis. It means describing and being aware at all times of your own position as a researcher in relation to your material, stating as far as possible your own beliefs, cultural assumptions, and history, which may impact on your qualitative data analysis and synthesis. It increases the trustworthiness of the research results, but also in this project, for me, it played a very specific role. It allowed me, a middle-class woman who largely identifies as white despite a mixed-race background, to remain sensitive to the questions and issues that were in play for a group of exclusively Muslim participants, often dispossessed and socially and culturally disadvantaged in relation to the Grenfell tragedy. It allowed me to uphold a high standard of ethical conduct in my research and to respect my participants' personhood in their lived experiences. Finally, reflexivity allowed me to identify vicarious trauma, which is defined as harmful changes that occur in professionals' view of themselves, others, and the world as a result of exposure to the graphic and/or traumatic material of their clients. I'm quoting there from a 2006 study on vicarious trauma, which is in my references. In my case, I found that listening to the participants' account of their fears and the trauma they had suffered was beginning to affect me. I was able to identify this because I was keeping a reflexive diary to record my thoughts and feelings in response to the data I was collecting. Fortunately, I had a good, trusting working relationship with my supervisor, and that allowed me to share difficult feelings safely at an early stage. As a result, I outsourced my transcription, attended some vicarious trauma training, read around the subject, and built resilience into the project as I went forward. It also helped the NCA to learn some lessons around awareness and swift support for vicarious trauma in research situations going forward. So there were a few areas of potential bias around the study. People who were strongly affected by the fire, or people who feel they have difficulty expressing themselves in English, may have excluded themselves, which may make the sample unrepresentative of the overall clinic patients. By the same token, the people who chose to take part may have made that choice because of a personal investment and a wish to support the clinic, and that may have led to a bias towards positively reported outcomes. It was also noticeable that the sample population was almost completely female. That is to say that 12 out of the 13 were female. All participants were Muslim. This is quite a high degree of homogeneity in the sample. And because no demographic data has been collected to describe the entire clinic population, we have no idea whether the sample was representative or not. There were some contextual factors too, which may have influenced the research process and therefore the outcomes, such as the ways that participants perceived the effects of their treatment and how they communicated that lived experience to me as the researcher, and also how I perceived and interpreted participant experiences, which I was discussing on the last slide when I talked about reflexivity. There are some limitations too. Perhaps the strongest of these relates to the fact that this was a snapshot study conducted over just 6 weeks without any follow-up, which means we don't have any insight into how the effects of acupuncture might change over time. For all these reasons, I made the recommendation that future studies in this area of the effects of acupuncture in humanitarian aid situations should consider probability sampling using a longitudinal study design with a more heterogeneous sample population, which is representative of the overall clinic population. Here are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.